Good morning, everyone. My name is Krasi Hoffman with MetricStream, and today we have a special panel conversation for all of you. We have the analysts, premier analysts of the GRC space here in the conversation with us today. And we're going to talk about how the GRC professionals are responding to the crisis and how they can prepare to reopen and respond to crisis in the future. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Forrester Chartis and GRC 2020 leading GRC analysts and have them introduce themselves and what their research focuses on and how they can be helpful to the GRC community. Good morning. We'll start with you, Mike Rasmussen from GRC 2020. If you would introduce yourself, and then Alla and Sid.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Michael Rasmussen with GRC 2020 Research. I've got, it looks like 27 years of experience now. The 90s was focused a lot on IT security and risk. Managed information security consulting practice in the Chicago, Milwaukee market. Had a stint at healthcare as well as manufacturing before that, doing IT security. Then moved over to Forrester, where our other panelist, Alla, is from. I spent 7 years at Forrester and regularly got one of their top analyst awards, and left Forrester at the end of 2007 to go independent. My focus is helping organizations. My job is research, like the other panelists, to understand what keeps organizations up at night in the context of governance, risk management, and compliance, and how they solve that with strategy, process, and technology. In that context, I interact with a lot of roles. The predominant role I interact with is corporate compliance and ethics, but also a lot with enterprise and operational risk, internal audit, and some from my roots in IT security. But that's a little overview of my interactions. I cover things very cross-industry and around the world. About 40% of my time is with organizations in North America. Another 40% of my time is in Europe, particularly the United Kingdom. And 20% of my time is the rest of the world. And so that's sort of a breakout of my research and coverage.
Thanks, Michael. Alla?
Sure. Thank you, Krasi. I'm excited to be here. So my name is Alla Valente. I'm an analyst at Forrester, and I cover security and risk management. My coverage specifically focuses on GRC, as well as the area of third-party risk, which also includes risk management of the supply chain, and RegTech, so the technologies that enable regulatory compliance through a digital transformation perspective. Similar to Michael, I also speak with heads of risk management, compliance. I also speak to CISOs and procurement sourcing organizations as they look to get a better handle on their third-party risk management programs. My background is financial services and GRC. Very happy to be here.
Thanks, Alla. And last but definitely not least, with a unique perspective from London, Sidharth Dash.
Hi, my name is Sidharth Dash, Sid Dash for ease of pronunciation and simplicity. I am with Chartis Research, and I have around 25 odd years in risk management, starting in the sort of in currency trading, and then moving to funds, and then from there into technology consulting, and then finally as an analyst with Chartis. At Chartis, we cover risk. So we are a risk technology specialist, risk and analytics technology specialist. And we cover a broad range of risk areas, but in GRC specifically, we cover sub areas with great focus like model risk, the IT infrastructure, IT resilience, risk quantification, cyber risk quantification, cyber risk analysis. And the overarching area we cover, the whole GRC area, we spend a lot of time around the analytical frameworks around it, the modeling of it, and how can you sort of introduce controls and how can you leverage technology. We have a broad range of clients, mostly vendors in the space, as well as a lot of financial institutions. And we do our base research, but we also do a lot of advisory work supporting that. But yeah, fundamentally, we work with a lot of financial institutions and energy firms. Finance and energy are our main areas, are major areas of focus, if you will.
Thanks, Sid. And that leads us to the first question. In 2008, the financial services crisis felt almost like a dry run for today's crisis. What do you think, in your view, the risk professionals learned about the critical situation in 2008, those lessons that were applied today? And I'll ask you first, Sid.
Is that first for me, or is that for Ala?
Yes, first for you. No, this is a first question for you. 2008
Okay.
financial crisis. What did
Sure.
the financial institutions learn to fare better this time?
Sure. So I think in many ways, the crisis in 2007, 2008 was generated within the financial sector. So it is a financial sector crisis, and clearly there was a huge restructuring of the regulatory environment, the capital management environment that was there at that time. That has served financial institutions really well. I mean, if you the balance sheets have been far more resilient than the past. There's the sort of whole regulatory cycle and the regulatory technology that evolved in the last 10 years. That's really been a very powerful element. But in addition to that, besides the financial sort of stability that it brought these institutions, we think that there's been substantial focus on things like data management, data lineage. Where do you have the data? How do you manage the data? How do you control the data, and roles and responsibilities, as well as focus on looking at the digital backbone. And ultimately, that's been really helpful in this crisis, as institutions suddenly had to go much more distributed than they're normally used to. The the whole emphasis on BCPs and so on was a huge help. Even though this crisis was a bit different from the last one, whereas the previous crisis was much more financial in nature, this crisis is much more operational in nature, and in many ways the inverse of the last crisis. But nevertheless, just the whole exercise in stress testing, developing a greater focus on the digital infrastructure that underpins the institutions, we think was very helpful. I mean, no transition in this crisis can ever be seamless, but we think it was definitely very helpful. Additionally, we think the regulators learned a lot of lessons. They learned to work more closely with their charges, with the banks and so on. So we think the whole transition, as the financial institutions went distributed very rapidly within a month or two, that was really helped by the way the regulators worked with the financial institutions to enable that to happen, in a pragmatic sort of way.
That's very interesting, a bright spot here in the response. So we're going to focus on the crisis has happened. Now it's the time to prepare to reopen. And so what would be the changing role of the risk professional, and how their role is changing to prepare in the midterm right now and then in the long term? And we'll invite you, Ella, to please take this.
Thank you, Krasi. So I think there's some good news in that even before the pandemic, organizations, especially risk managers, have been really shifting their business priorities to focus less on compliance and more around the concept of business resilience. And with the digital transformation, we've seen acceleration of innovation, acceleration of focus on the customer experience. And so companies have, in their own way, started along this journey to go from compliance to resilience. And there's definitely been progress that's been made, but I think what the pandemic highlights, and the reason the pandemic is different than the financial crisis or other events that we've seen in the past, is that it doesn't have bookends. It doesn't have a start date and an end date. It started and it's still ongoing. And so we need to try and manage through this crisis and into the recovery stage, so to speak. I think that the role of risk management is going to be critical. It's been critical for how companies have been able to stay operational during this time, but it'll be even more critical as organizations plan on reopening, bringing employees back, bringing their processes and their systems back to, a sense of normalcy, whatever the new normal is going to be. I think that the things to focus on in the short term is really the accuracy of a business impact analysis. Organizations are looking at different measures to reopen and do it safely, do it in a way that promotes the health and safety of their employees. But what risk managers need to do is help the business understand the risk implications of the decisions that they're making. So to give you an example, I know we've heard a lot about reconfiguration of the office space, maybe bringing back employees in stages, maybe even doing temperature checks. Well, there are risks involved in doing those things as well. So for example, there are regulations around what you're able to ask employees about pre-existing medical conditions. Now we're even seeing some research that highlights that these temperature checks might be in violation of ACLU and some other regulations as well. And so I think that any steps organizations take in how they bring their employees back is going to need to be facilitated by the role of risk management. I think in the longer term, as we go forward, we're going to want to look a little bit more carefully at business continuity and making sure that we have not only the plans in place, but those plans have been tested and we've learned from that experience and we're able to adjust and optimize and pivot so that we can respond in a very agile way to all sorts of risks that may come up. The next crisis, it doesn't necessarily have to be a pandemic. It can come in some other form, but we'll need to shore up our business continuity. We'll need to create better visibility into third-party ecosystems. Certainly, the fragility of our supply chains will need to be addressed. And so I think that risk managers will play a critical role in the near term, but also they have their work cut out for them in the longer term.
Thanks, Ala. Michael, would you like anything to add?
Certainly. I mean, we're going to see a lot of changes in risk management coming out of this pandemic. For one thing, and I've written a lot on this over the years, but enterprise and operational risk management programs have been overly captivated on IT security risk. Now, IT security risk is a huge risk. I'm not denying that. I cut my teeth, my professional career in IT security. But I've seen a lot of very unbalanced enterprise and operational risk management programs in which they're overly focused on IT security risk at the cost of a lot of other risks, particularly things like a pandemic risk with health and safety. Look at this. This has been on the top of the World Economic Forum risks out there for years. We've been warned about it by business leaders like Bill Gates, former President George W. Bush and others. This is not a black swan event. We knew this was coming at some point. We've had pandemics in the past, some on a greater scale, if you go back to the Spanish flu 100 years ago, and some on not quite as big of a scale. But this isn't a black swan event, and being unprepared for a risk doesn't make it a black swan. It just means that you're ignorant. And so in that case, I see a lot of enterprise and operational risk management programs are going to take a much more balanced view of risk that includes things even like environmental risk and health and safety risk and quality risk across a range of operations. Leonardo da Vinci stated, realize that everything connects to everything else. The physicist Friedrich Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they're interconnected and interdependent. We have an interconnected risk environment, and we need to be able to see these risk connections And a lot of organizations, when they've only focused on IT security, fail to see the interrelationships of risk. Look at this current event. You have a health and safety risk, which is triggered off economic risks. It's triggered off employee and other health and safety risks. Work from home environments means more IT security risk. There's greater risk of fraud during tough economic times. And so we have this cascading effect of risks, all from what started off with the health and safety risk. You look at the third party area. I'm doing a lot of research in what we call third party GRC, third party governance, risk, and compliance. Now, the official definition of GRC found in the OSEC GRC capability model is that GRC is a capability to reliably achieve objectives, that's the governance function, while addressing uncertainty, that's risk management. In fact, ISO 31000 says that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And active integrity, that's the compliance. Now, third-party GRC is the ability to reliably achieve objectives while addressing uncertainty and active integrity in each of our third-party business relationships. And you just take the risk and the third parties in supply chain. I'm seeing a much broader focus because this health and safety risk of a pandemic has triggered, greater risks of modern slavery, in which, as certain parts of the world, we have factories that are being hit hard with the health and safety of the pandemic, and employees are sick and dying, and they're starting to staff people that are forced labor and child labor. And there's greater risk of slavery, modern slavery, in our supply chain and third-party relationships. There's greater risk of bribery and corruption as we have, restricted supply chains, and where there's greater chance that somebody within our organization might bribe and pay that foreign government official, to be able to expedite our goods or through customs or through and into the supply chain more quickly. So we have greater risk of bribery and corruption risk. We have greater risk, in the whole digital office environment. From the home remote workers, increased IT security. We have increased things like even harassment risk, where people aren't in the corporate environment, they're working from home. I'm finding over and over again that organizations are starting to find that they have increased issues and complaints about harassment, because people in their home office environments are a little more casual, and they're saying things through communications, whether it's Zoom or text or email, that aren't appropriate in the corporate environment, that they normally wouldn't do in the corporate environment, but they're working from home and they're not quite used to this new environment. They're crossing some lines somewhere. It's an interconnected risk environment, and we have to have an enterprise and operational risk management program coming out of this that be able to see the full spectrum and interconnectedness of risk across different departments. That's one key area.
Thanks, Michael. That's a really great and broad perspective. So moving on to the next question, and we had great participation this morning and yesterday from interesting speakers. One of the speakers had shared Verizon this morning on the panel on platform and development, talked about we have to think about risk as harmonizing the risk, not monopolizing the GRC, in the sense of bringing all different perspectives together. And with that in mind, what should GRC leaders keep in mind as their organizations prepare to return and to resume business operations? Let's think at the technology level here for a second, Sid.
Sure. So I think one of the big things is not to unlearn the lessons that we've learned during this crisis. I mean, one of the things, clearly the GRC leaders and risk professionals, clearly they need to be the guardians of the technology infrastructure, the digital backbone that institutions have. Clearly, it's turned out that you can run a fairly distributed institution. You can run a very distributed financial institution, but you have to have a digital backbone that supports the nature of risk that you want to take. Your digital risk appetite needs to be as clearly defined as your financial risk appetite, and your ability to decide, what kind of distribution you want to support. All of these guys all of the teams are at home, or do you want to have some of them at home, some of them brought in at some points in time? So when we start bringing people in together again into offices, do not unlearn the sort of emphasis that was there on figuring out how to manage this whole technology configuration. And hence, it's really important when you think about cyber risk or IT risk and so on, think about it in more quantitatively, think about it in a more analytical way, figure out your exact risk appetite. All of those elements need to be brought back into this new environment where there will be a more complex distribution of people than there used to be. It will be maybe satellite offices, maybe all of them in one place again. But we think that'll be rare, where we will just go back to square one. But I think there's a lot of lessons just during the crisis, but just even before that, the requirement for risk professionals to be the, if you will, the guardians of that infrastructure, the intermediaries between senior management and IT and operations, to be able to articulate in easy to understand ways what the risk in the operations environment is, what the risk in the IT environment is. And we think historically that's been a relative challenge. The second thing is to be more agile in building your risk models, managing your risk models, and managing your stress testing and so on and so forth. And that agility that we've seen in the last couple of months, we need that to be sort of continued, because this is not the last shock. This time it was a pandemic. Next time it may be a geopolitical crisis. Next time it may be something else. But that ability to be more agile in stress testing, ability to be more agile in risk quantification, ability to think your risk appetite fairly quickly, and also have a communication layer between IT, ops, and senior management. We think that's really important, and that communication layer is not trivial, because we think that's really been the challenge in IT risk analysis so far. In the sense that IT and ops risk analysis has really suffered from the fact that it's not easy to communicate, and sometimes it's overly quantitative, sometimes it's overly simplistic, but that link hasn't really been there, and it's been developing, and we think there's some really strong shoots during this crisis. We think different institutions displayed different behaviors, different ways of communicating it and adjusting their risk appetite. We think those lessons should be learned and taken forward.
Great, so thank you. And on the topic of quantification, we can move on to the digital transformation side of things. Yesterday, the Verizon session was particularly on risk quantification, very interesting topics about how to bring all of these disparate risk metrics to a single score and create the so-called digital currency. So I'll turn this on to you. With the digital transformation of GRC systems systems and programs, automation will be invariably introduced, AI and analytics as well. So what are your expectations of platform providers to meet this moment, and what should we be doing to serve our customers better?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I want to just touch on something Sid said a moment ago with digital backbone. So our business is run on a digital backbone. And to think about GRC or risk management in the context of enterprise and operational as being in one sort of bucket, and IT risk in something that's completely different, I think is a very dated and antiquated way of approaching this topic. We have the convergence of IT and OT. Every business, whether it is a product business or a services business across every industry, runs on technology, it runs on data, it runs on our digital currency, so to speak. And that means that protecting and securing that data is really an enterprise risk. It is something that is fundamentally key to how every business executes on its strategy going forward. But I think what we need to do is really take a look at and better define automation versus AI versus analytics. When we think of automation, this is the same processes that are just enabled by technology. I might be dating myself, but I remember when I started my career, businesses ran on AmiPro and Lotus 123. That was a form of automation. But can we say that that is something that would help us manage risk in today's environment? No, it wouldn't. It's not just about setting your processes to leverage automation technology. What I think firms really need to get a better handle on is, first of all, the analytics portion, which is how do we identify patterns, how do we operationalize large volumes of information. So that's something that's definitely critical in today's, big data, digitally transformed enterprise. But we are also increasingly looking at AI, machine learning, natural language processing. And I think that's, it's more than just GRC platform providers being this efficiency play. We now need to get into this resilience play. And where GRC platforms can play a role in this is digitally transforming the part that's compliance. Because let's face it, a lot of the data that we need for our compliance processes already live in the enterprise. They already live in our data center, and we should be, managing that by exception. We can tell AI what are the desired outcomes and what are the expected outcomes and triggers that we have. And when it finds, when it identifies events that are outside of that, then we get flagged. And what that will enable us to do is focus more on the risk management portion of this. As we look at quantification, I think that's really important as well. We are bringing together different areas of the business, the operations focused, the risk focus, and certainly the IT focus. But the area that we can align on, and perhaps the language that we can use to get that common ground, is quantification. It's being able to look at not the probability of a risk occurring, but if the risk occurred today, what would this mean to our organization from a financial perspective? What would it cost us to remediate? What might it cost us in losses that occur, or even fines that might take place? And so I think that naturally the risk quantification and the ability to leverage AI and machine learning in our GRC platforms is what's going to get us from compliance to resilience.
Thanks, Ala. Appreciate it. And we'll close with Michael. And I think this is probably the most important question today for the entire GRC community. How do you see the future of the GRC leaders and their teams, and what retooling of their skill set would be expected? What would they need to do to take advantage of advances in technology that Ala just mentioned?
Well, it's going to involve several things. So, first off is strong collaboration. Because as I mentioned in my previous comments, this is an interconnected risk environment. And, we need to be able to see these interconnections, and technology and artificial intelligence and analytics all plays a significant piece in that. But we need to be able to present that to the people that actually manage and monitor the risk, as well as own the risk throughout the front lines of the business. And so in that context, we need strong collaboration to be able to see these interconnections and understand that what might be a health and safety risk just doesn't impact health and safety. It has this cascading impact that involves IT security, that involves environmental, that involves quality and procurement in the supply chain, and all these different areas. And so we need this interconnected view of risk that with technology that can provide good collaboration across these different departments and functions. The other clear thing that we need as far as skill sets is that we need good right brain as well as left brain thinking Too often, risk management has been trapped in left brain thinking. We have our risk models and our quantitative risk analytics, and if something doesn't fit our models, we don't really see the risk then. And we still need that left brain thinking. We need the structured thinking about risk. There's no doubt about it. But we also need, in those skill sets, good right brain thinking. The ability to think creatively about risk, to be able to see those interconnections in the scenarios and how risk plays out in the organization. We need strong right brain creative thinking on risk as well.
That's fantastic. We have many more questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Really appreciate all of your participation today. Always very insightful to speak to all of you. And thanks so much for joining us from around the world. Back to you guys.